Pilot removes black billionaire from flight, but her call for justice goes viral. In an unexpected turn of events, a black billionaire was removed from a flight, sparking a profound conversation on social justice and equality. This compelling story has captured the attention of millions, as the billionaire's call for justice has gone viral across social media platforms. The incident unfolded when the pilot, citing undisclosed reasons, asked the passenger to disembark, leading to a heated exchange and public outcry. Tell us whether you find great excitement in this narrative. Press 1 if the video delighted you. Press 0 otherwise not. Your comments really motivate me to compile more inspiring and significant narratives.
Vanessa Davis adjusted the strap of her sleek leather handbag as she stepped into the first-class cabin. The cool air carried a faint blend of citrus and vanilla, the kind of scent designed to evoke luxury and calm. She wasn't fazed by the opulence. She was used to it. Her tailored cream blazer and matching slacks hugged her form perfectly, her natural curls framing her face like a halo. Yet, despite her composed demeanor, she felt the familiar weight of unseen eyes crawling over her. It always began the same way. The polite smiles of the flight attendants faltered slightly as she approached, their practiced warmth freezing for a fraction of a second. They recovered quickly, of course, offering rehearsed pleasantries, but the damage was done. Vanessa noticed everything, and this time was no different. "Welcome aboard," the flight attendant chirped, her smile tight and a shade too bright. Vanessa returned the smile, gracious as ever, and handed over her ticket. "Good afternoon." The attendant barely glanced at the boarding pass before gesturing toward her seat. Vanessa noted the subtle furrow in her brow, the way her eyes lingered on the premium seat assignment, as though trying to solve a puzzle. Ignoring it, Vanessa moved gracefully down the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted floor. Seat 2A was hers, an aisle seat at the front, offering extra space and privacy. She slid into it, her movements measured. She always moved like this in public spaces, with purpose but not haste, aware of how quickly a confident stride could be misinterpreted as arrogance when it came from someone like her. As she settled in, she caught a flicker of movement from the corner of her eye. The pilot, Captain Derek Shaw, had stepped out of the cockpit. He was tall, with graying hair and a crisp uniform that seemed to amplify his air of authority. His gaze swept the cabin briefly, then landed on her. His expression hardened. Vanessa turned away, pretending not to notice. But she could feel his stare linger, hot and accusatory, before he turned on his heel and disappeared back into the cockpit. The tension was almost tangible now, like a low-frequency hum that only she could hear. Vanessa adjusted the scarf around her neck and pulled out her book, a well-worn novel she had read before but carried for moments like these. It helped to appear engrossed, unreachable. Minutes ticked by. More passengers boarded, each greeted warmly, with none of the hesitation Vanessa had endured. The flight attendants began their rounds, offering pre-departure drinks and taking care of last-minute details. Vanessa politely declined the offer of champagne, opting instead for water. That was when it began. The whispers. She heard them from 2 rows behind her, sharp fragments that pierced through the cabin's tranquil atmosphere. "Are they sure she's in the right seat?" one passenger murmured to another, their voices barely hushed. "Looks like she wandered in from economy." Vanessa's jaw tightened, but she kept her face neutral. Years of practice made it easier, though never painless. The words always found their mark, chipping away at the protective shell she had built around herself. The pilot emerged again. This time he strode directly toward her, his expression as cold as steel. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low but firm. "Could I see your boarding pass?" Vanessa blinked, surprised by the bluntness. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze head-on. "You mean the one I already handed to the flight attendant?" "Yes," he replied curtly. "It's standard procedure." Standard procedure. She doubted that. She glanced at the surrounding passengers. None of them were being asked to re-verify their tickets. The whispers had stopped, replaced by curious eyes watching the exchange unfold. She reached into her handbag and produced the slip of paper, her movements deliberate. "Here you go," she said calmly, handing it over. The pilot scrutinized the pass as though expecting to find something amiss. When he didn't, he hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. He handed it back, but his suspicion lingered in the air. "Thank you," Vanessa said pointedly, her voice steady. Captain Shaw didn't respond. He walked away, disappearing once more into the cockpit. Vanessa's hand trembled slightly as she placed the ticket back in her bag. She clenched her fists, grounding herself. This wasn't the first time she had been treated like this, and it wouldn't be the last. But today felt different. Today she was tired of pretending not to notice. A flight attendant appeared moments later, her expression apologetic but rehearsed. "Ma'am, can I get you anything?" she asked, as if trying to smooth over the earlier confrontation. Vanessa shook her head. "No, thank you." The attendant lingered for a moment before walking away. The whispers resumed, quieter now but no less cutting. Vanessa closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. She thought about the phone in her handbag, the number she could call. But not yet. Not yet. She opened her book and waited. The fight was only beginning. Vanessa sat still, the novel open in her hands but unread. The weight of the cabin's air pressed down on her, thick with the unspoken judgments of strangers. Her fingers lingered on the page, tracing the words as if their rhythm could drown out the growing discontent around her. Minutes passed, marked only by the muted clinking of glasses and the muffled hum of passengers settling in. Yet she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Her instincts told her to look up, to confirm the stares she knew were there. But she resisted. Engaging would only invite confrontation, and she wasn't ready to expend that kind of energy. Not yet. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, their polished uniforms brushing against seat edges, their smiles carefully maintained. One of them, a young man with neatly combed hair and a nervous energy, paused near her row. He glanced at Vanessa as if debating something internally. Finally, he leaned down, his voice low and hesitant. "Ma'am, I just want to let you know that everything's fine," he said, his words clearly meant to reassure but falling far short of their mark. Vanessa lifted her gaze, her expression neutral but piercing. "I wasn't aware there was a problem," she replied softly, her tone laced with an unspoken challenge. The attendant flushed slightly, stammering. No problem at all. Just, if you need anything, please let us know." She gave him a curt nod, dismissing him. His awkward retreat only added to the growing tension in the cabin. Vanessa closed her book, setting it on the polished tray table before her. The edges of her patience were fraying, and she could feel the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. She needed an anchor. Reaching into her handbag, she pulled out her phone. The reflective surface caught her image, and for a brief moment she studied herself. Her posture remained impeccable, her expression unreadable. She was a picture of composure, but the storm inside her was undeniable. Her fingers hovered over the screen, the urge to call David intensifying. She could hear his voice already, firm, reassuring, unyielding. He would handle this in a way that demanded resolution. But Vanessa hesitated. She had always prided herself on fighting her own battles, on confronting prejudice head-on with dignity and strength. Calling him felt like surrendering a part of that, and she wasn't ready to relinquish it. Not yet. The sound of the intercom startled her. Captain Shaw's voice filled the cabin, smooth and authoritative but carrying a sharp edge of irritation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a slight delay. Please remain seated as we sort out a minor issue." The words hung in the air like a noose. Vanessa didn't need to look up to know that the delay had everything to do with her. The murmurs returned, louder now, emboldened by the captain's announcement. "What's the holdup?" a man muttered from across the aisle. "This is ridiculous." "I bet it's about her," another voice chimed in, softer but no less cutting. "Why does this always happen?" Vanessa's grip on her phone tightened. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to remain still. It wasn't the first time she'd been cast as the problem, the disruption, but every instance chipped away at her resolve, each one leaving behind a scar invisible to the world but deeply felt by her. Her resolve broke when a shadow loomed over her. She looked up to see Captain Shaw standing there again, his expression colder than before. "Ma'am," he said, his tone clipped, "I need to ask you to step off the plane for further verification of your ticket." A hush fell over the cabin. Every pair of eyes turned toward her, the weight of their stares crushing. The murmurs stopped, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. Vanessa rose slowly, her movements deliberate. "And why exactly do I need to step off the plane?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "For the safety and comfort of all passengers," the captain replied, his words measured but dripping with condescension. "I've been informed there might be an issue with your boarding pass." Vanessa arched an eyebrow, her poise unshaken. "My boarding pass has already been verified, twice. If there's a problem, perhaps it's with your system." The pilot's jaw tightened, and the faintest flicker of frustration crossed his face. "It's standard protocol." "Let's not pretend this is standard protocol," she interrupted, her voice now sharper, each word like a blade. "No one else has been asked to re-verify their ticket. So, Captain, let's be honest. What is this really about?" A ripple of unease passed through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, some avoiding her gaze, others watching intently, drawn to the unfolding confrontation. Captain Shaw's face darkened. "I don't appreciate being accused of anything improper, ma'am," he said tightly. "Either you comply or we'll have no choice but to remove you." Vanessa's heart pounded, but she stood firm, her chin lifting slightly. "You can call security if you like. I'm not moving until I've spoken to someone higher up, someone who understands the meaning of professionalism." For a moment it seemed the pilot might explode. His hand twitched, his face reddening. But before he could respond, Vanessa's phone vibrated in her hand. She glanced at the screen. David. Her lips curved into the faintest smile as she swiped to answer. "Hello, darling," she said, her voice soft but carrying a new energy. "I need a favor." David's voice came through the line, calm and commanding. "What's going on, Vanessa?" She turned her back slightly, shielding the phone from prying ears. "I'll explain later. Just know that I'm on flight 412, and there's been an incident." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then David's voice hardened. "I'm on it." Vanessa ended the call and slid the phone back into her bag. She looked up at Captain Shaw, her expression unyielding. "You might want to get comfortable," she said coolly. "This flight isn't taking off until my husband gets here." The passengers behind her gasped, their curiosity now fully piqued. Captain Shaw's confidence wavered, a crack forming in his otherwise steely demeanor. Vanessa returned to her seat, crossing her legs elegantly and reopening her book. She wasn't just waiting anymore. She was preparing for the moment when justice would finally arrive. The minutes stretched out like hours as Vanessa sat in her seat, the cabin alive with the quiet tension of unresolved conflict. The weight of the pilot's ultimatum lingered in the air, blending with the murmurs of passengers trying to piece together what was happening. Vanessa didn't bother to listen. Their opinions didn't matter. She knew exactly what this was about, and she wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her hands rested on her lap, steady now, the earlier tremble replaced by resolve. She wasn't merely waiting for her husband, she was preparing for the confrontation that was sure to follow. Vanessa glanced at her watch. 10 minutes. David was efficient, but the airport wasn't exactly built for speed. Still, she knew he'd arrive exactly when she needed him to. A voice broke her focus. "Excuse me, ma'am." She looked up to find the flight attendant from earlier standing nervously by her seat. Her polished smile was gone, replaced by a strained expression that barely concealed her discomfort. "Yes?" Vanessa replied, her voice as composed as ever. I just wanted to make sure you're all right," the attendant said, her words faltering under Vanessa's gaze. "I know things have been tense." Vanessa tilted her head slightly, studying the woman. The sentiment seemed genuine, but it was far too late for that. She offered a small, cold smile. "I'm fine, thank you." The attendant hesitated, clearly wanting to say more but lacking the courage. After a moment, she nodded and stepped away, leaving Vanessa alone once more. The cabin grew quieter as the murmurs subsided, replaced by a new kind of silence, the anticipatory stillness before a storm. Vanessa could feel it in her chest, the weight of something big on the horizon. She leaned back in her seat, her eyes fixed on the aisle, waiting. And then it happened. The cabin door swung open and a wave of cool air swept inside, carrying with it an unmistakable presence. The murmur of passengers returned, louder now, their curiosity turning to confusion, as a man in a tailored Navy suit strode onto the plane, David Carter. His arrival was unassuming in the way that only true power could be. He didn't need to command attention. The room gave it to him willingly. His tall frame moved with purpose, his sharp features set in an expression that was both calm and unyielding. A thin gold tie clip gleamed against the rich fabric of his tie, a subtle nod to the understated elegance that defined him. Vanessa didn't move, but her lips curved into the faintest smile as her eyes met his. He gave her a small nod, his gaze softening for just a moment before hardening again as it swept over the cabin. He wasn't here to reassure her. He was here to make things right. Captain Shaw emerged from the cockpit, his expression one of barely restrained annoyance. He clearly hadn't been expecting this. "And you are?" the captain asked, his tone sharp. David's gaze locked onto him, and for a moment, the captain faltered under the weight of his presence. "David Carter," he said simply, his voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "I'm here for my wife, Vanessa." The murmurs returned, louder now, passengers craning their necks to get a better look at the man who had just disrupted their flight. Vanessa stayed in her seat, her expression calm but her heart pounding in anticipation. "Mr. Carter," the captain said, his voice tight. "I assure you, this is simply a misunderstanding. Your wife—" "My wife," David interrupted, his tone cutting through the captain's excuses like a blade, "is seated in first class with a valid ticket. Am I correct?" The captain hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a response. "Well, yes, but there were concerns raised about—" "Concerns?" David's voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was a sharpness beneath it that made the captain flinch. "What kind of concerns exactly? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your concerns have nothing to do with policy and everything to do with prejudice." A ripple of shock passed through the cabin. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap, impossible to ignore. Passengers exchanged glances, some looking away in embarrassment, others nodding in quiet agreement. The captain's face flushed. "Mr. Carter, I don't think it's appropriate to—" "What's inappropriate?" David said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "Is targeting my wife, humiliating her in front of an entire plane, and delaying this flight over nothing. I own enough shares in this airline to know its policies inside and out. So tell me, Captain Shaw, what protocol were you following when you singled her out?" The silence was deafening. Vanessa watched as the captain's composure crumbled, his confidence replaced by a growing sense of panic. He stammered something unintelligible, but David didn't let him finish. "Save it," he said coldly. "I'll deal with you later." Turning away from the stunned captain, David extended a hand toward Vanessa. "Shall we?" Vanessa rose gracefully, sliding her hand into his. She felt the strength in his grip, the silent reassurance that he was there and he wasn't going anywhere. Together they turned toward the cabin, the whispers of passengers now a dull roar. But David wasn't finished. He turned back to the captain, his voice calm but lethal. "You'll be hearing from me, and from my legal team. This isn't over." The captain didn't respond, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Vanessa and David walked down the aisle, past the wide-eyed passengers and stunned flight crew. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence alone was enough. And as they stepped off the plane, Vanessa felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about ensuring no one else would ever have to endure what she had. The air outside the cabin felt different, thicker, charged with an energy Vanessa couldn't quite place. The terminal was bustling as usual, with travelers hurrying between gates and announcements echoing overhead. But to her, the world had slowed. Every step she took alongside David felt deliberate, the sound of their shoes on the polished tile a rhythmic reminder that this was far from over. Vanessa glanced at her husband. His expression was unreadable, his jaw set, his eyes focused ahead. This was David in his element, a man who thrived in moments of chaos and confrontation, his calm exterior masking a mind already calculating several steps ahead. She admired him for it, but she also knew what it cost him. They reached a quiet corner near the airline's customer service desk, the noise of the terminal fading into the background. David turned to her, his hand still holding hers. For the first time since he'd arrived, his gaze softened. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but laced with concern. Vanessa hesitated, the question catching her off guard. She wasn't used to being asked that, not in a way that mattered. She nodded, but the tightness in her chest betrayed her. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. I didn't expect it to go this far." David tilted his head, studying her. He didn't press, but she could see the weight of his thoughts behind his eyes. "You shouldn't have to expect this," he said simply, his tone firm. "Not anymore." His words were a promise, one that carried the full weight of his resolve. Vanessa felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. There would be time for tears later. Now wasn't the moment to let her guard down. David reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. "Give me a minute," he said, stepping a few feet away to make a call. Vanessa leaned against the wall, the cool surface grounding her. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself breathe. She could still feel the stares from the cabin, the whispers that had followed her every move. It wasn't new, but the accumulation of experiences like this weighed heavier with each passing year. She opened her eyes, glancing at her reflection in the nearby window. Her posture was perfect, her outfit immaculate, but she could see the fatigue in her eyes. This wasn't about just her anymore. It never had been. David's voice brought her back to the present. He was speaking in measured tones, his words precise and deliberate. She couldn't make out the conversation, but the clipped phrases told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a phone call. It was the first domino in a chain reaction that would ripple far beyond this flight. When he returned, his expression was unreadable again, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes. "They're coming," he said. "Who's they?" Vanessa asked, though she already had a sense of what he meant. David didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "Just trust me." Vanessa nodded, though her nerves were starting to fray. She hated not knowing what was coming next, but she trusted David implicitly. He had never let her down before. It didn't take long. A group of 3 people approached from the other end of the terminal, their strides purposeful. Vanessa recognized the woman in the middle immediately. Margaret Wynne, the airline's chief operating officer. She was flanked by 2 men in dark suits, their presence radiating authority. Vanessa straightened instinctively, the instinct to brace herself kicking in. Margaret reached them, her expression tight but polite. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Davis," she began, her voice measured. "I'm so sorry for what you've had to endure today. This is unacceptable, and I want to assure you that we are taking this matter very seriously." Vanessa exchanged a glance with David. She could see the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior, but he kept his voice steady. "It's not just unacceptable," he said, his tone cold. "It's systemic. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and I doubt it will be the last. So tell me, Margaret, what exactly is your plan to fix it?" Margaret faltered slightly, the power dynamic shifting under David's sharp gaze. "We'll be launching an internal investigation," she said quickly, "and the captain has already been placed on immediate suspension. We're also reviewing our training protocols to ensure—" "That's not enough," David interrupted, his voice cutting through her rehearsed response. "This isn't about one captain or a few protocols. It's about the culture of this airline. The systems that allow people like him to act with impunity. If you think suspending him and issuing a few apologies will solve this, you're mistaken. Margaret's face flushed, but she nodded. I understand, she said carefully. We'll take additional measures. I'll be overseeing them personally, David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As of this moment, I'm leveraging my stake in this company to demand a full review of its policies, leadership, and culture. And believe me, Margaret, I won't stop until real change happens. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Vanessa saw a flicker of fear in Margaret's eyes. She nodded again, her professionalism cracking under the pressure. Understood, Mr. Carter. We'll cooperate fully. David nodded once, satisfied for now. Good. I'll expect updates within the week. Margaret and her team left quickly, their departure as hurried as their arrival. Vanessa watched them go, the tension in her chest slowly easing. She turned to David, her expression a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. You didn't have to go that far, she said softly. David looked at her, his eyes warm but resolute. Yes, I did, he replied, because if we don't fight for this now, they'll just keep getting away with it. Vanessa nodded, her heart swelling with pride and love for the man who had stood by her side through everything. Thank you, she said quietly. He took her hand again, his grip firm and steady. Always, he said, and together they walked away, the echoes of their footsteps a reminder that this was just the beginning. Vanessa leaned back against the leather seat of the car as it glided through the evening traffic. The city lights blurred outside the window, streaks of gold and red dancing against the darkness. She usually found this view comforting, the movement and glow a reminder of life's rhythm. Tonight it felt heavy, oppressive, like the weight of the day was etched into the skyline itself. David sat beside her, his gaze fixed ahead. His hand rested lightly on hers, his thumb tracing absent circles against her skin. It was a small gesture, but it grounded her, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this battle. She glanced at him, studying his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the faint crease between his brows. He was deep in thought, strategizing even now. David, she said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice felt foreign to her, like it didn't belong in the quiet cocoon of the car. He turned to her, his eyes softening. Yes, I didn't mean for it to get this far, she admitted, her gaze dropping to their joined hands. I didn't want you to have to fight this fight for me. David's lips curved into a small, rueful smile. You didn't make this happen, Vanessa, he said, his voice gentle but firm. This fight isn't just yours, it's ours, it's everyone's. She nodded, but the knot in her chest didn't loosen. I've dealt with this kind of thing my whole life, you know that, and I thought I'd gotten used to it. But today, her voice trailed off, the words sticking in her throat. He squeezed her hand. Today was different because it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was humiliation, plain and simple, and you didn't deserve any of it. She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I'm so tired, David. Tired of always having to prove myself, of always having to fight just to exist in spaces I've earned my place in. His grip tightened, his expression hardening. I know, he said, his voice low and steady. And that's why this can't keep happening. Not to you, not to anyone else. We have to make them see that. Vanessa let out a shaky breath, leaning her head against his shoulder. The faint scent of his cologne, cedarwood and bergamot, wrapped around her, a familiar comfort in the chaos. She closed her eyes, letting the steady rhythm of his breathing soothe her. The car slowed as it turned onto their street, the familiar outlines of their home coming into view. It was a sprawling house with wide windows and a wraparound porch, a testament to the life they had built together. Normally it was a sanctuary for Vanessa, a place where she could shed the armor she wore outside and simply be herself. Tonight it felt like a reminder of the battle they were about to face. The driver opened the door for them, and David stepped out first, offering her his hand. She took it, the warmth of his palm steadying her as she stepped onto the driveway. The cool night air kissed her skin, but it did little to ease the heaviness in her chest. Inside, the house was quiet, the soft hum of the central heating the only sound. David guided her to the living room, where he poured her a glass of wine and handed it to her. She took a sip, the rich notes of blackberry and oak lingering on her tongue. It helped, but only a little. He sat beside her, his arm draping over the back of the couch as he studied her. "What's going through your mind?" he asked. Vanessa sighed, setting the glass down on the coffee table. "I keep thinking about the people on that plane," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way they looked at me, the things they said. It wasn't just the pilot, David. It was all of them. Even the ones who didn't say anything, they were complicit." David's expression darkened. "You don't owe any of them your silence or your forgiveness," he said. "What happened today was a reflection of their ignorance, not your worth." She nodded, but the memory still stung. "I know," she said, "but it still hurts." He reached for her hand again, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I know it does," he said softly, "and that's why we're going to change things. Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever felt like you did today." Vanessa met his gaze, the fire in his eyes sparking something inside her. It was a reminder of why she loved him, not just for his strength, but for his unwavering belief in justice and equality. He didn't just see the world for what it was, he saw it for what it could be. "I believe you," she said, her voice steady now, "and I'm with you, whatever it takes." David's lips curved into a small smile, the weight in his eyes lifting slightly. "Good," he said, "because this is just the beginning." They sat together in silence after that, the weight of the day slowly giving way to a quiet determination. Outside, the world continued on, unaware of the battle being planned within the walls of their home. But Vanessa knew one thing for certain. By the time they were done, the world would be forced to notice. The morning came slowly, sunlight seeping through the sheer curtains of Vanessa and David's bedroom. The warm glow of the rising sun spilled across the room, but for Vanessa it did little to ease the knot of tension still coiled in her chest. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the events of the previous day playing in a relentless loop in her mind. Every whisper, every dismissive glance, every veiled accusation, it all echoed, refusing to fade. She turned her head slightly to see David sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to her. His shirt was unbuttoned, and his broad shoulders were hunched as he typed furiously on his tablet. Even at this early hour, his determination hadn't wavered. He was already working, already preparing for the battle they'd promised to fight together. "David," she said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. He paused, his fingers hovering over the screen before he turned to face her. His eyes, though tired, were filled with an unshakable resolve. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm. "How are you feeling?" Vanessa pushed herself up, leaning against the headboard. "Better, I think," she said, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her lingering unease. "Still processing." David set the tablet aside, his full attention now on her. "It's going to take time," he said, "but we're going to make this right." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. "What's the plan?" she asked, her tone steady now, the fire in her returning. David leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I've already scheduled a meeting with the airline's board of directors," he said. "Margaret's going to be there, along with several other key decision-makers. We're going to address this head-on." Vanessa frowned slightly. "Do you think they'll take it seriously, or is this just damage control for them?" David's lips pressed into a thin line. "They'll take it seriously," he said, his tone firm, "because if they don't, I'll make sure they regret it." There was a cold certainty in his words that sent a shiver down her spine, not fear, but a quiet awe at the depths of his conviction. David wasn't just her husband. He was her fiercest ally, a man who refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. "And what about the pilot?" Vanessa asked, her voice growing sharper. What happens to him? David's jaw tightened. He's already been suspended, he said. But that's not enough. I want a full investigation into his conduct, not just with you, but with every passenger he's ever interacted with. If this is a pattern, we'll expose it. Vanessa nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. She hated that it had come to this, but she knew it was necessary. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, dismissed, or invisible. By mid-morning, the house was alive with quiet activity. David's legal team had arrived, their presence marked by the low hum of conversations drifting from the study. Vanessa kept her distance, letting them work while she prepared herself mentally for what lay ahead. She paced the living room, her bare feet sinking into the plush rug as she rehearsed what she might say at the meeting. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. She froze, her heart skipping a beat before she forced herself to move. David appeared in the doorway just as she reached the foyer, his expression calm but alert. "I've got it," he said, his hand brushing against hers as he passed. Vanessa lingered near the staircase, her fingers gripping the banister as David opened the door. A man in a dark suit stood on the other side, his face grim but professional. Vanessa recognized him immediately. Peter Harris, a senior executive at the airline. "Mr. Carter," Harris said, his tone carefully measured. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us on such short notice." David stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "This isn't a courtesy meeting, Mr. Harris," he said coolly. "This is about accountability." Harris nodded, his expression tightening. "I understand," he said, "and I want to assure you that the airline takes this matter very seriously." Vanessa stepped forward, drawing Harris's attention. His gaze flickered slightly, a hint of discomfort flashing across his face as he took her in. "Mrs. Davis," he said, offering a stiff smile. "I'm deeply sorry for what you experienced yesterday. It was unacceptable." Vanessa studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Words are easy, Mr. Harris," she said finally. "What I care about is action." Harris shifted uncomfortably, his smile faltering. "Of course," he said quickly. "That's why I'm here, to listen and to act." David's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile that carried no humor. "Then let's not waste any more time," he said, leading the way to the study. The meeting stretched on for hours, the room heavy with tension as David and his team laid out their demands. Vanessa sat quietly for most of it, observing the interplay between her husband and the airline executives. Harris tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear he was out of his depth. Every point David made was precise, every demand backed by evidence and legal precedent. When Vanessa finally spoke, the room fell silent. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "This is about every passenger who's ever been treated as less than. Your policies didn't fail me yesterday. Your people did. And until that changes, your words mean nothing." Harris looked at her, his face pale. "We'll do whatever it takes to make this right," he said. Vanessa leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Good," she said, "because if you don't, we will." The weight of her words hung in the air, unshakable, as the meeting continued deep into the evening. The sun dipped below the horizon by the time the meeting ended, its departure casting the study in soft shadows. Vanessa sat still as the executives shuffled their papers and murmured among themselves, their carefully maintained professionalism now fraying at the edges. They avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the meticulous notes David's legal team had handed them, pages filled with demands, evidence, and the sharp edges of accountability. David stood by the window, his silhouette backlit by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. His presence filled the room, quiet but commanding. He turned to face them, his expression unreadable but sharp. "You have everything you need," he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made the executives flinch. "Now it's time for you to act." Peter Harris, the senior executive who had spoken the most during the meeting, cleared his throat nervously. "We appreciate your patience, Mr. Carter," he said, though his words lacked conviction. "Rest assured, we will begin implementing these changes immediately." David tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing. "Patience isn't what got us here, Mr. Harris. Don't mistake this for leniency. You've been given an opportunity to fix what's broken. Don't waste it." Harris nodded quickly, his face pale. "Of course. We'll follow through." Vanessa finally rose from her seat, her movements slow but deliberate. The room fell silent as she stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She stood beside David, her presence as commanding as his. Her voice was calm, yet it carried an edge that sliced through the air. "This isn't just about yesterday's flight," she said, her gaze sweeping over the executives. "It's about what your passengers experience every single day. You have the power to change that. But if you don't, people like me, people who've had enough, will make sure the world knows who you are." Harris swallowed hard, his composure cracking. We understand, Mrs. Davis," he said. "We'll make it right." Vanessa held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the study, her back straight and her head high. David followed, his footsteps matching hers. In the quiet of their living room, Vanessa sank onto the couch, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. David sat beside her, his arm draping over the back of the couch as he studied her. "You were incredible in there," he said softly, a hint of admiration in his voice. Vanessa let out a small, tired laugh. "I'm not sure that's the word I'd use," she said, "but thank you." David reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "You've always been incredible, Vanessa," he said. "It's just that now, they've finally seen it too." She met his gaze, her eyes shimmering with a mix of exhaustion and determination. "I don't want this to just be a moment, David," she said. "I want it to mean something." "It will," he promised, "because we won't let it be anything less." The next morning, Vanessa woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She groaned softly, reaching for it without opening her eyes. The screen glowed brightly in the dim room, displaying an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" she said, her voice thick with sleep. "Mrs. Davis?" A woman's voice replied, brisk and professional. "This is Margaret Wynne, the COO of the airline. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Vanessa sat up, her heart pounding. "Not at all," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to personally update you on the steps we're taking following yesterday's incident," Margaret said. "We've begun a full internal review, as discussed. Captain Shaw has been formally removed from duty pending the investigation, and we've initiated mandatory bias training for all flight staff." Vanessa listened silently, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to be relieved, to feel like progress was being made, but another part of her knew this was just the beginning. "I appreciate the update, Miss Wynne," she said finally, "but I hope you understand that words alone won't fix this." Margaret hesitated, the faintest crack in her confident tone. "We do understand that, Mrs. Davis, which is why we're committed to transparency and accountability moving forward. If you have any further suggestions or concerns, I'd be happy to discuss them with you directly." Vanessa considered this for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be in touch." As she ended the call, she felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, skepticism, and a flicker of hope. She glanced at David, who was sitting across the room with his tablet, already immersed in the day's work. "Margaret Wynne," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Looks like they're trying to get ahead of the fallout." David smirked, setting the tablet down. "Good. That means they're scared." Vanessa let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "You're impossible," she said, though her voice was warm. He crossed the room, sitting beside her and taking her hand in his. "You're the one they should be scared of," he said, his tone serious, "because you're the one who's going to make sure this doesn't stop here." Vanessa looked at him, her resolve solidifying. She nodded. "You're right," she said. "This isn't over, not even close." And as the morning sun bathed their living room in golden light, she felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in a long time, the belief that change was possible. The days that followed were a whirlwind of calls, meetings, and decisions. Vanessa and David worked tirelessly, their home transforming into a command center for change. Every conversation with airline executives, legal teams, and advocacy groups carried the weight of a movement, pushing for accountability and systemic reform. Vanessa found herself stepping into a role she hadn't anticipated, a voice for those who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. What began as a deeply personal fight quickly grew into something larger. Stories began pouring in from passengers across the country, accounts of prejudice, humiliation, and neglect. Some were heartbreakingly familiar, others were shocking in their cruelty. Vanessa read each one, her resolve hardening with every word. David supported her at every turn, his strategic mind navigating the complexities of corporate politics while she spoke directly to the people affected. Together, they became a formidable team, their determination unwavering. The meeting room at the airline's headquarters was packed. Executives sat at the long table, their faces a mix of apprehension and resolve. Cameras from various media outlets lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the podium at the front. Vanessa stood there, a microphone clipped to her blazer, her hands resting lightly on the podium's edge. She scanned the room, her gaze steady and unflinching. "This is not about one flight," she began, her voice clear and firm. "This is not about one captain or one company. This is about a culture that has allowed discrimination and bias to persist unchecked. It is about the countless passengers who have been made to feel unwelcome, unsafe, and unseen." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. "We are here today not just to address what happened to me, but to demand systemic change. Change that ensures every passenger is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. This is only the beginning, and we will not stop until these changes are not just promised, but delivered." The room erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls. Vanessa stepped back, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her emotions. She glanced at David, who stood in the corner, his expression filled with pride. He gave her a small nod, a silent reminder that they were in this together. The reforms came faster than Vanessa expected. The airline announced sweeping changes to its policies, including mandatory bias training for all employees, an independent review board for passenger complaints, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Captain Shaw was permanently removed from duty, his history of misconduct made public. But Vanessa knew the work wasn't done. She and David established a foundation dedicated to advocating for fairness and equity in the travel industry. The foundation quickly gained traction, partnering with other organizations to push for broader reforms. Vanessa became a sought-after speaker, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience and unshakable resolve. Months later, Vanessa and David sat together in their living room, a sense of quiet finally settling over them. The house felt different now, less like a battleground and more like a home again. Vanessa leaned her head against David's shoulder, her fingers laced with his. "Do you think we made a difference?" she asked softly. David kissed the top of her head, his voice warm and steady. "I know we did," he said. "But it's not just about what we've done. It's about the people we've inspired to keep fighting." She smiled, the weight in her chest lifting slightly. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace, not because the fight was over, but because she knew it was moving forward in capable hands. As the evening light faded, bathing the room in a soft golden glow, Vanessa allowed herself to exhale. The fight wasn't over. It might never be, but for now she could rest, knowing she had done her part. Together they watched the city lights flicker to life outside their window, a quiet reminder that the world kept turning, and that they had changed it even if just a little. And that's how one woman's courage and determination turned a moment of humiliation into a powerful stand for justice. This isn't just her story. It's a reminder that no act of discrimination should ever go unchallenged, and that change begins with those bold enough to demand it.
Tell us whether you find great excitement in this narrative. Press 1 if the video delighted you. Press 0 otherwise not. Your comments really motivate me to compile more inspiring and significant narratives.